My name is Ben Seeley, and I'm an MBA student here at MIT Sloan. It is my pleasure to introduce our panel this morning, Inside Stories, the Era of Athlete-Driven Content. Our panelists today are Constance Schwartz-Marini, co-founder and CEO of SMAC Entertainment, Megan Rapinoe, soccer legend, activist, and New York Times bestselling author, and Marie Donahue, Chief Business and Growth Officer at DraftKings. Our panel will be moderated by Shira Springer, lecturer here at MIT Sloan School of Management. The panel will run for 40 minutes, and we will leave 5 minutes at the end for Q&A. Please submit your questions via the Cadence app. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Shira.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks to all of you for being here. I'm very excited to have this conversation about athlete-driven content. And one of the reasons I'm excited is because we have three different perspectives with respect to content represented here. We have Constance, who produces the content. We have an athlete in Megan. And with Marie, we have someone who buys the content. So with that in mind, I wanted to start and see from those three perspectives how they have seen content evolve over the last many years where athlete-driven content has come into the fore. So we'll start with you, Megan, the athlete driving the content. How have you seen athlete-driven content evolve? And then we'll go to the producer and then the buyer.
I mean, I think traditionally the content that we were getting from athletes was just either on the court, field, whatever, at a press conference or media. And the advent of social media obviously put that into our hands. And I think very quickly athletes realized how powerful that could be, both in the negative and the positive. But I think particularly for female athletes, realized as we were shut out of so much, this was the way that we could open ourselves to the world, really, and share our stories, sell ourselves, get out whatever things we wanted to talk about. And now we're in a completely different era where there's series or athletes sort of owning their own content, participating, producing their own content, more than just social media, monetizing their own content. So not all of it is good. A lot of the content's bad, but you don't have to watch it. I think it's great that athletes have the ability to speak directly to their audiences, to own their own content, and to be able to financially participate in what is already happening, and what has been happening sort of off their back for a long time. And I think we're seeing how much of a cultural driver, particularly in women's sports, how much of a cultural driver that really is. And ultimately, if you're in the culture, if you're in the conversation, the business is going to follow. And we're seeing that now with women's sports.
You got to be in the conversation. Yeah. And it's better if you're driving the conversation. Yeah. Constance, your view from a producer perspective.
I echo everything Megan was just saying, and it's been really refreshing because it used to be us trying to come up with story ideas and going after the athlete, and now we're receiving a lot of incoming calls because they've seen the work we've done, whether it's with Coach Prime or Tony Gonzalez or any of our other people we've worked with, and they understand that they can have a point of view. In a lot of instances, and I'm just speaking from a personal point of view, they can't produce it. They can't officially be an executive producer because of the journalistic integrity, depending on who's buying it, and also if they're not self-financing it or we're not self-financing it. With that said, we very much partner with them in the sense if there's a really pivotal moment happening with their children that they're like, please turn these cameras off. It doesn't help any of us to force them into a situation that they're not going to then want to support it, or you're then not going to have these athletes calling you to say, would you partner with us on things like this? So it's been amazing. We were lucky enough, thanks to Marie, we had 3 seasons of Coach Prime on Prime Video. And even though Coach wasn't an executive producer, he saw every cut before it went out. And there were times that he would say, I disagree with this segment, and we'd have to explain to him why that needed to stay. And then he would be okay with it, whether he agreed or not, but it just from a journalistic integral point, we had to keep it in. But it's been fun. And I think Marie, obviously, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but being that you started 30 for 30s, like I'd love to hear your point of view on how much it's changed, because you guys really drove and created that lane for many years.
Thank you. Checks in the mail, constantly. Thank you. So first of all, good morning. I can't tell you how excited I am to be up on the stage. It's great to meet you, and particularly with two people I admire so much. And a big part of me wishes I were actually out in the audience listening to you two. So I echo everything Megan said about athletes taking more control and having more direct access. And I think what Constance is referring to is, she knows this, several years ago, if we were to work directly with athletes on projects, we actually, and you know this from your background, we would get a lot of pushback because there were editorial integrity issues. And now fast forward several years, everyone has a production company. I know Megan has a production company, A Touch More, which we're excited to see what you've got coming out. Obviously the podcast, but I suspect there's a lot more coming that isn't ready to be announced, but wait with bated breath. So now you have, whether it be Megan and Sue, you have Omaha with Peyton Manning, LeBron was a real trailblazer with Spring Hill. And so now you literally have athletes driving huge projects. And I think it's been, I think from a business perspective and from a buyer perspective, it's been nothing but good, nothing but positive. Obviously, you have to price things correctly and understand how it will resonate, but it drives engagement. So many of sports fans now are focused more on athletes than the teams and the leagues. We see this at DraftKings. More and more of our bets are based directly on players, and you see it in editorial coverage. So I just think it's great for sports, and I think it will continue to be a very net positive.
When we talk about content, we can talk about a lot of different formats. And so I'm curious, and you don't all have to answer this if you don't want to, but I'm curious if you have a content format preference, if there's something out there that you're seeing, if you're a fan, podcasts are hot, or if maybe you're more of a documentary person or a TV series, but what are your preferences? What do you think is perhaps the best channel, best format for athlete-driven content? Or is it dependent upon the athlete?
All of the above.
Like I say, you may have a great insight into this.
It is. I mean, we're in the middle of developing a scripted project about the 72 Dolphins, the undefeated team, with one of the players' daughters who's a writer. And so for us, that as much as a documentary would be exciting, for me to be able to have the creative liberty to work hand in hand with, with Sonia Warfield, like how amazing is that? So like that's one project. Then podcasts, like obsessed with what you guys are doing. Like we're all in the cars, we're on planes. Like I just love hearing different points of view. I work with Erin Andrews, and Erin and Carissa Thompson have a podcast called Calm Down with Erin and Carissa, and they just headlined, the Buccaneers did a She Is Football yesterday. 800 women showed up. People were flying from all over the country. So the demand is there, and so as long as there's demand, like I can check a box for all of this. And then there's game shows. I mean, so it's like we can keep coming at all of it. And just, I really am excited to see what you and Sue are gonna do, because you're really the first female-led company, which I think is so exciting, that we need more and more of that.
I'm just curious, you said something about the demand being there, and maybe Marie, this is a question for you in the sense that has consumer taste changed over time? We talked about the content and the relationships there changing, but as a buyer, are you seeing consumer taste change at all? Demand being different?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there are trends, and both Constance and Megan talked about that. I'm a big believer in storytelling. If it's a good story, you can figure out the right format. And it's increasingly important you have to find the right partner. When you're talking about formats, I love documentaries, and one of the reasons I love them so much is to me, they're the safest. They're guaranteed hits if you do them right. Like we had a rule at 30 for 30 where we would only greenlight a film if you would write a script about the story. So if it's just like a straightforward retelling of a match, not that interesting. But if it has a story arc and a hero's journey and the whole thing, you could always make a good film out of that. So I love documentaries, and I think, they go in and out of favor. Sometimes the market can get a bit saturated, but I think podcasts are have been having a moment, and it's going to continue to grow. I just saw something the other day that YouTube now has their podcast traffic is bigger than every other platform. You guys do yours on video now, right? I'm still used to the ear. I find it.
I don't watch podcasts.
Yeah.
I listen to them. I don't.
Well,
but most people, I would say,
Yeah.
most people I see in the wild or hear in the wild,
Yeah.
watch their podcasts. I think it's crazy, but people love it.
How do you? I have a question. Can I?
Yeah,
ask a-
absolutely.
So
Please,
one
have
of the
the
reasons I
conversation.
love podcasts, and we did this back in the day in Grantland, it was such a great touch point with fans because it's so intimate. Like you literally, you take them on walks, you take them on runs, they're in your ear. Do you get different, can you tell who your podcast fans are versus your sports or your, I mean, you do so much off the court, but like, can you tell other podcast fans, do they feel like they know you because of that connection more than someone who's watched you play or just admired you and your social?
I don't know if I feel that yet. I mean, I played for a long time, so I feel like people think they know us. You know?
Yeah, that's true. Probably,
and,
yeah.
And we have talked a lot for a long time. But there is something different about, we're talking about different stuff. It's not about us playing. Yeah, I think people come up and say, they're like, I love your podcast. I listen to your podcast, not like I saw you play at this time. I mean, we get a little bit of both. But I certainly feel that with the podcast that I like. It is a very different experience than watching something or, turning on a show or watching a documentary. It's more woven into my day-to-day than any other kind of content.
You can tell I'm an avid listener. So can I ask one more question?
Sure.
So because it's so intimate and you guys obviously can talk about anything you want, how broad do you think you'll ultimately go? Like, do you see a world, because you're pretty broad already in what you guys talk about. Do you feel it's a format that will let you talk about?
Yeah, I mean, we're the
Anything
boss. We can
you're-
talk about
I
whatever we
love
want.
it. Yeah.
Ultimately. I mean, I think for us, our realm is women's sports. And so, like, good luck putting a lid on that. I think that is really the special thing about it is that because women's sports has, women and black women and gay women and straight women, it's like it's going to cover the sort of spectrum of humanity. It's also a wildly growing business, a business that's been suppressed for a long time, and now everyone is sort of catching up, like, oh my God, this is crazy. And I'm like, I know, we told you that. We've been telling you that for a really long time, but I think it allows us the space to talk about things. And I think we both, Sue and I both really like the longer format because we can really get into the nuance of certain issues and how these other things intersect. I mean, women's sports, it's rarely just what the headline is. There's always going to be a sort of deeper lens that we need to look through it with and talk about it with. And I feel like that gives us, podcasting gives us the ability to, do the headlines and sort of say what's going on in women's sports, but then also like have a more nuanced take on why this is happening and sort of the historical context of that we miss so much. I mean, Sue said on her last panel, because there's been such a, I think you said gaping hole in, you were talking about data, but storytelling, mostly in women's sports. If you think of this is the perfect place to be, Boston, to talk about like the intergenerational storytelling that goes on for the men's sports teams here. Like, so much, I know so much about the Boston Celtics. I'm not a Boston Celtics fan, but I know so much because I've been living in the world for as long as I have, and I love sports. So there's just such a break in the storytelling for us that really affects the business, because ultimately you want people to be buying into the storytelling and understanding and becoming fans of teams, and their kids become fans of teams. So I feel like our job a little bit is to try to like stopgap the break in storytelling and educate people into something that they might be coming to for the first time.
Love that we're talking about storytelling. It's something that I teach. And I'm curious, let's start like with a basic question in the sense that what makes for good storytelling, right? What makes a good story? What do you look for? I'd love to hear your perspective on that, Constance, and then we'll turn to you, Megan, in terms of what do you look for? What do you think makes for good storytelling, particularly when it comes to women's sports and filling that gap?
For us at SMAC, is it something we would watch? Are we interested in it? Has it not been told? And also, is it on brand for us? I mean, there's definitely projects that we probably would have made a lot of money on, but it was not something we wanted to be attached to. We may have watched it, but it just, we've worked so hard, you know, on who we are and who we represent. We love being a voice for the voiceless, and that's something that we always look at. And again, are you going into the storytelling part of it with a willing partner? Because if somebody doesn't want to be attached to it, that's also something we look at. Sounds basic, but it works for us.
And having bought a bunch of Constance's content,
Thank you
I would tell
Texting
you, she does things driven by her heart and what she thinks is right, and is so passionate that even things we might not think would make financial sense, when you walk out of a room with Constance and you end up having bought them, like the Black Quarterback and some other things we worked on with you. And she ends up being right. We've told the story that we almost passed on Coach Prime. Constance was so passionate about it, and where I worked at the time, we did a lot of research before we approved projects. And for whatever the research team was looking at, Dion did not break through. But if you talk to a sports fan, anyone out in the world, Dion is a charismatic, influential figure. If you go to a football game with him, if you go to a high school, I mean, people love Dion. And so she does high wire stuff. She does where she brings cameras into the locker room, and that's a little high wire for me, because you don't know what you're getting, and you could get nothing, or you could get
But that's an
magic in a
important,
bottle.
I think, point that you made, is you definitely need the believers, right? Because without Marie believing, and she had to convince a lot of people on her team to take a chance on us, because you're sitting there like, who could pass on Coach Prime? Everybody passed on us back then, except for Marie. And now you look and you're like, that's a no-brainer, but they didn't see it. So you definitely need, you know, those beacons of light that can see your passion. And the other point that I'm talking again, sorry, but it's not just about getting the story made. We are all in on the promotion of it. It doesn't end with that. It's like, we are going to go above and beyond to make sure, you know, when it's Strahan, who's my business partner, he has nothing to do with being in the story, but he'll go on Fallon, he'll go on all the talk shows and promote it. So I think that's so important, that as producers, it doesn't end when it's on the screen or your phone.
I'm just going to add one thing to show what a magician Constance is. When we had Coach Prime on Amazon, anytime Dion was interviewed on another network, including a 4-letter one that doesn't let you promote other products, he would not go on without promoting our project on Prime.
Correct.
So this woman delivers.
Ah, thank you.
So Megan, what makes a good story for you? What do you look for?
I think it's all about authenticity. And in our ever increasing algorithmic content nightmare, it's like the algorithm doesn't probably pick great things. Your data analytics team missed on Prime. So, but it's like, how are those systems built, and why are they missing the things that are really
People
authentic?
building them, probably.
Yeah, exactly. So we sort of know the shortcomings there, but I think it's all about authenticity, and I think that's why female athletes have been able to leverage social media in particular in the way that they have, in such a strong way, because people want something that's real. That's why people like documentaries. That's why it's like, no matter what it is, it's like, anybody see My Octopus Friend? Like, fucking unbelievable. I'm just like, I don't know, I'm not deep diving on like octopus culture, but it's real and it's interesting, and you're getting the human story. This is why people love sports between the lines, is because you're watching a team full of people who are in their most vulnerable state, which is trying their hardest and being explicit about the fact and vulnerable about the fact that, like, they're putting it all out there and this could go bad. That's what people want to see. That's that sort of high wire act. And so for me, that's what content is. Like, if you're going to do something, do it all access. If you're going to be involved in something, go all the way. If you're going to have a podcast, actually talk about the things that you want to talk about and be real about it. So I think and that's probably what you're looking for, is those stories that, like, maybe on the surface it's not something that makes sense, but there's a group of people that are really passionate about it, you're passionate about it, or it hits in some kind of way. But I just think the authenticity part is the biggest factor, and what people really want to see out of athletes. And I think that's part of why athlete-driven content has become so popular also, because you're not getting, an answer to a question that maybe they don't want to talk about. You're getting exactly what they want to talk about, what the athletes want to talk about.
Not an actor playing a role, but just adding to what you said about authenticity, on the brand side of the business, we have a representation side. I always say to the clients, would you use this product for free? Because if you're telling me no, I don't care how much money it is, they're going to see right through it. And that's so important, in addition to the storytelling, it's all about authenticity. And it's fun that it is about authenticity, because I mean, we've all been authentic our whole careers, which is why we're where we are. But I'm sure you've all dealt with people that don't even know who the hell they are anymore. And this is just so refreshing to be able to say what you mean and mean what you say. And so much of that goes back to the fact that athletes can control their narrative through social media. That's definitely changed the trajectory of media, of storytelling, and of just controlling whether you're being traded, how you're being treated. When Coach Prime was in the hospital, people were trying to figure out what was going on, and we would just take his phone and put things out there just enough to protect him, because at that point we didn't, and I'm not telling anything that didn't come out through his narrative, but you're going through such a personal time that you don't need to worry about who's in the hospital that's going to leak what's really happening. So authenticity just goes across every single thing. If there's one thing I can say for all of the students that are about to embark on their careers, it's just stay true to yourself.
So I think it's interesting that you mentioned authenticity. Megan, you're saying authenticity, vulnerability. If you're going to be all access, be all access, right? But as an athlete, putting yourself out there, do you have to set boundaries? Are there decisions that you have to make about how much you're going to share, when you're going to share something, where you're going to share something? And if there are, and I'm assuming there are, what is that decision-making process like for you?
I think it really is personal to each individual. I think you can be, what I was saying, vulnerable, all access, wide open, and still not share everything. Being an athlete is inherently being a public person, and just because you're a public person doesn't mean the public is entitled to everything that you are. I think it's really important to keep something back. Otherwise, it's like piranhas. You just get eaten alive. There's nothing left for you. Sue and I feel this, obviously, in our podcast. We talk a lot about our relationship, but there's all the things we bring to couples therapy do not make it onto the podcast. We'll just say that. There's things in our life that we want to share and that we like to talk about and that we're open with and we feel like it's fun. And then there's things about our personal life that are just personal. I'm sure you just alluded to that with Deion Sanders and how much he wants to share. But I do think it's really important. Some people, are more comfortable with more being out there. I think it's a really personal decision, but I think that each person has to understand where their own boundaries are and keep that. I don't think it's a better product if you overshare. I don't think it's a better story if you're uncomfortable in that. Ultimately, if you're the subject of the story or the sort of the main character, you want to be there in a way that feels good for you. Otherwise, you're probably going to clam up anyways.
Mm-hmm. Maria, I'm curious, as a buyer, Megan mentions, you don't want to make people uncomfortable in some respect. Do you look at some products? Are there some things that you either get pitched or see and you're like, I don't know, this is maybe not making me a little bit uncomfortable, or do you use that as a metric
sure.
to
I mean,
authenticity?
it's not necessarily limited to just what people are revealing, what Megan was talking about. But sure, I'm a big believer in you can bring people up or you can bring them down. And so I personally just prefer positive content and affirming content. And I mean, I know there's some great stories where people have gone through things. And so, yeah, you're always making choices as a buyer. And like in life, you have to figure out what you put out into the world. And so I think that we're all humans, so that definitely comes into play. Mm-hmm. I love, when we're talking about the trends with athletes, I just love, obviously things can be picked up and taken, and clipped and things like that. But I love that athletes are the boss of what they're producing now. And you can do an hour podcast or interview on if there's something you want to talk about and want to dive deep into. You don't have to. So that probably makes you more comfortable discussing things, I would think. Yeah.
I think so, for sure. You get to be in charge of your own narrative, what you say. Of course, things can be, clipped and whatever, but I think getting to choose how you talk about something and not just having to answer a question, those can be a little unpredictable at times. So to be able, whether it's Angel Reese or Sue and I talking, like, we can talk about the things that we want to talk about. Ultimately, if people don't like it, they don't have to listen, and that's totally fine. It might not be for everyone, but I think that is important to have that space and have that control over the things that you're talking about publicly.
I want to stay on that topic of narrative control because I was listening to the most recent episode of A Touch More, and you were talking about Diana Taurasi's legacy. And it struck me, it's not just your narrative that you can control, but there is a way in which you are framing women's sports and the narrative of women's sports when you are talking about Diana Taurasi. And I'm curious how important that is to you as somebody who's out there producing content, creating content, to think very consciously and intentionally about the story you're telling about your friends, women's sports, women's basketball, women's soccer, all of it.
Well, I think for those of us who've been in women's sports for a very long time, we've seen the power of narrative happen for a very long time, and how positive that can be and how negative that can be. I always go back to an amazing article Kate Fagan wrote a number of years ago, where she said the well has been poisoned around the WNBA and the narrative. And for so long, women's sports has had the same negative narrative that's just like, it's like in the air. It's like through osmosis. Everyone thought for so long that we didn't like women's sports, and now all of a sudden we love it. Like, nothing changed about women's sports. Nothing really changed about the WNBA or the NCAA tournament or the NWSL or the World Cup or whatever it may be. People just started to change the way that they felt about it. So the narrative changed around it. A huge part of that, as I'm beating a dead horse, but athlete-driven narrative, athletes telling their stories, taking their story back. And so for something like Diana, she played the majority of her career, I'll say, in the poison well years, where people weren't watching at the rate that they are now. Because anybody who knows Diana, and I feel like I'm, even a little later to it, but obviously having, the luxury of having the vault that is Sue's brain craft that narrative, would know that Diana is the most exciting player on and off the court that maybe any athlete ever has been. And I mean, every single one of your favorite athletes, like, put it all together and, like, that's Diana. But a lot of people don't know that. And so, yeah, we could say, like, the GOAT retired. And it's like, okay, she was a great player and she retired, and most people don't know. But we have the ability through our podcast to sort of keep the recipe and to tell the story and to fill in that gap in storytelling, narrative, history, legacy, funny, all the good, all the bad that went into her career, all the winning, and what made her. Because again, it's like, why do we like sports? What made Diana great? What made people want to go watch her is like all in the nuance. So it was really special, I think, for both of us to be able to pay tribute to one of the greatest female athletes of all time in a way that most of us and most female athletes would just never get. And that's really a shame for that individual person, but also it's a shame for the larger business of women's sports, which is growing crazy right now, because you're missing a vital element about what makes this sport and what makes this environment attractive in a business sense and commercially, which ultimately is what we want. We want it to become a multi-billion-dollar year-over-year industry that everybody loves, and there's big business platforms that can kind of be shoulder programming around the actual sports that's happening.
Which they definitely need to buy more female-led content. We've experienced it a couple times now, that stories, that great content, authentic, from our hearts, and people passed on them. And I feel like those are going to come back around, and people are going to call us and say, hey, you guys still have that? Because we want it, which is what I really hope. And that's where brands can also come into play, like P&G, who has so many female-led brands, like branded content, like they can act as the studio. So I'm in the trenches with these guys, just trying to get more and more female-led content out there.
Love that. And I also want to stay with you, Constance, because I think there's narrative control and then there's editorial control. And you were talking about that earlier, about Coach Prime didn't want something on air, and you kind of had to talk to him about why this was important to have as part of the story. And I'm curious how you navigate those relationships with the athletes, who this is their story, and the editorial control, what makes a good story, what they think makes a good story, what will be well received. What conversations do you have? Take us inside.
With Coach Prime, in most instances, he wants it all out there. But so that was a lot of the times. But for him, it was, a great example is he said, this is out of sequence. And we said, you know that, but the viewer doesn't know that. And if we keep it in sequence, it won't work as well for the story, because the way these, especially if it's not a 90-minute, like this was a 5 or 6 episodic series, you do have to come up with what's each episode about. It's not, these reality shows where cameras are on all the time and you're just throwing it all out there. It's not a day-to-day that's just, running on a YouTube or something, which are great too. I've had other clients that works wonders for. So it's the one thing I can say about any athlete we've worked with. When you sit down and have the conversation on why this will work, why this doesn't work for the story, they 99% of the time understand it. And at the end of the day, the buyer has the final editorial control. So unless you're self-financing one of these docs or a docuseries, at the end of the day, the buyer does have the final say. And that's why there are a few docs that we've heard great things about but aren't seeing the light of day, because the artist as well, or the athlete, artist, whoever, along with the producer plus the platform, aren't agreeing creatively. So you also don't want to just overrule the athlete or the artist and say, we don't care what your opinion is because we have editorial control, because the last thing you want is somebody that is a global superstar to say, we're not going to support this and we're not happy with it.
It's mostly relationships and not surprising people and being transparent, and really, I think, getting on, even as a buyer, getting on the same page about what the product is about and what the story is and how far you'll go.
Fantastic. I'm going to turn now to some audience questions. We'll start with this one. With short-form content becoming more popular, especially with the next generation of sports fans, how do you produce a piece of content that still has a great story in such a short window? I know, Megan, earlier you were saying, I love the podcast, I can go long, we can really get into the nuance, but how do you create great stories, great content in that short form that's in such demand now?
For us, we'll pull it out of the long form, because not everything can make it on air. So there are always those scenes that could just be, here's a beginning, middle, and end in 5 minutes, and those are the clips that'll go viral, that'll then hopefully draw the viewer into want to see the whole thing.
Yeah, I think it's even when you think about a game, it's enjoyable to watch the whole game. It's enjoyable to watch a 14-minute extended highlight of it. It's enjoyable to watch just the goal that's being scored. I think people like sports for lots of different reasons, and they consume it, especially now with the ability that we have, whether it's on the phone or platforms, you can clip it. Sometimes it's 2 seconds. Sometimes it's what the players are saying in their press conference that people care about more. Sometimes people care more about what they walk into the stadium or the arena in more. So I think it's again, it is authenticity and just sort of bringing these moments. You don't always know what's going to hit, but I think having the ability to have the longer form content that you can then pull and clip and give people a little taste of it, hopefully will bring them back to ultimately what you want them to be watching.
We're very well aligned with the audience here, because I had this question on my list as a fun question. It says, what podcasts do you listen to? And I would add, what podcast do you listen to in addition to A Touch More? So we'll start with you, Marie. What podcasts grab your attention?
Yeah, I listen to way too many podcasts. So
there's no such thing.
Yeah, I listen to there's a
a touch more.
A touch, well, that's a given.
Given.
One more.
And I'm very excited that there'll be a live taping. Is that how you say it? There'll be a taping today after this, I think. So I'm excited for that. There's a media service, Puck. I don't know if you guys follow Puck at all, and they cover media, politics, fashion, everything, and I love their podcasts.
Town.
Yeah, The Town. They have a sports one. So I love them. I do listen to Calm Down, and I've been shocked because Carissa, who hosts, is one of our Thursday night football talent, and have been mortified that I was mentioned once or twice. Always positively, but it's weird. And you're like, what? It was more about my dog. Yeah, I mean, I just listen to a ton. It's way too many, to be honest.
All right, but an endorsement for Puck and what they're producing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love Pivot. I mean, yeah, there's a ton. There's so many great ones out there.
Pivot, I'm just gonna say Pivot, it's great. It's like a world that I'm, not in, don't know much about. I feel like Scott and Kara's dynamic is really just like funny and interesting. They have great chemistry and they teach me all kinds of stuff. It's a great one.
Everything that you guys mentioned, and then I'll add Gilly and Wallow. If you don't know them, they're just a blast and also really touch point on things that are happening in the cultural zeitgeist from a different lens that a lot of us are used to.
So this one is for Constance. It says, you mentioned being a voice for the voiceless. How have you thought about and approached engaging different types of athletes? Not all athletes desire to be content creators and big personalities. Is there an opportunity to engage and monetize a broader array of athletes to tell their stories?
So a misnomer about the doc space is when you're going to tell an athlete's story, they can't be in it for the money because yes, there is a nice fee that they will get, but they need to look at it as a platform to build whatever business they're trying to do, whether they're getting ready to retire or whether they're, launching something while they're still playing. We have a saying, keep the main thing, but use that platform to build around it. So in many instances, we'll get into it with somebody and they're like, no, I need to do this for $1 million. I was like, we'll try, but that's a really hard number to hit. So you've got to look at this as an opportunity to share your story and make the change, be the change, but also use it as a platform to go launch whatever, your production company, your podcast, your clothing line, like all the things. So that's how I approach things very differently with different athletes.
This one I'll direct to Megan. How do you handle controversy or negativity that sometimes arises in response to athlete-driven content? And the others can join in, but I'm curious, particularly from your athlete perspective.
I don't have a lot of personal experience with this, but just from the other athletes that I've been around. I mean, it's gonna come. It's part of it, and you have to be okay with that. To me, keeping the main thing is being a whole person. And so that for me was sort of always my guiding light. What do I care about? What kind of things do I want to talk about? Of course, not everybody is going to agree with everything that I'm saying. That doesn't mean that I shouldn't say it. I think using the platform that I have, whether that's, the U.S. Women's National Team while I was playing and the players, I thought we used it so well and we're so strong together. I mean, truly a sort of a hurricane of a force together. And it was just like, what do we care about? We care about winning. We care about human rights. We care about standing up for ourselves. We care about the growing business of women's sports. And we care about an accurate narrative about what sports are. So it's okay. People are going to disagree with you. I always looked at it like, who am I speaking with or on behalf of or for, rather than like, who am I speaking to? They probably aren't going to want to hear it anyways, and that's not really the point, but I'm, kind of focused on the opposite side of that. And usually if you're getting a lot of backlash about something that you're saying, it's kind of like a signal you're dead on the money. So if you're, getting a particular tweet or a particular narrative, I'm like, okay, thank you for the confirmation. On the money.
To say, I don't know if Constance or Marie wants to chime in with anything regarding athletes and negativity, negative comments, anything you advise or offer them.
Haters are your marketing team.
That's a great slogan. Haters are your marketing team.
It's a good one.
Love it. Just curious, Megan, you were bringing up the U.S. Women's National Team, and of course there was on Netflix, Under Pressure, the U.S. Women's World Cup team. And I'm curious, and this sort of dovetails with some of the audience questions, how does having cameras there, being constantly filmed, affect team culture, team dynamics? I would assume that you become something of a reality TV show, and that can be difficult in the most major tournament of your career. So if you could speak to that, how it affects team culture.
Yeah, I personally was advocating for a lot more access and a lot more of an embedded nature. I think the more embedded it is, the easier it is to stop seeing them, and to stop seeing the cameras. And again, I'm like, if we're gonna do it, let's do it. If we don't want to do it, then don't. So I really, I liked the doc. I really enjoyed it. I think it was more than people had ever seen from the team. But I personally was advocating for a lot more and a lot more player involvement. To your point, we want to change the narrative around women's sports. We want the business to grow. You want more money? Then the business needs to grow. You want more, NWSL teams. You want better stadiums. You want like the whole business to grow. You have to tell that story. I think it takes a really strong team and really a lot of trust within the leadership of the team and all the players and the staff and the coaching staff. And sometimes, that isn't there. Was a lot of people's like first World Cup. It was the coach's first World Cup. There was, I think, a lot of stress, and like ultimately, clearly, that team didn't have it, and wasn't, that sort of powerhouse on the field. So maybe that was part of it. I don't feel like I'm disparaging the team at all. We went out and tried our very best. But it is different. Not everybody wants to, which I think is okay. Not everybody wants to give an interview or be in front of the camera. But yeah, my whole thing is like, get all of the footage. This could be incredible. I always look at it like this could be incredible. I wish that we had a team embedded with us in 2019. That shit would have been like insane. That would have been an incredible film to see in whatever form it came out. But I do think it takes a lot of, trust and confidence and just the right timing for a full access kind of situation to happen.
All right, I want to end with two questions, one from the audience and then one from my list. From the audience, I think this is an interesting, and you can decide who wants to take this. If you all want to take it, great.
Maria will take it. Yeah.
Okay, Maria, you can take it. What advice would you share with an athlete who is just getting started in generating their own content?
I would ask for a meeting with Megan, first thing. And then I do think, not to quote Constance, but I do think you have to keep the main thing the main thing. And I do think probably with NIL and all these other opportunities, it's going to be more and more important that you focus. And the main thing may be making sure your brand and your sponsor is happy. Those are the things that I worry a little bit about, all the opportunities and pressures that younger athletes have. I think they're experiencing it, the opportunity, and in college, and so I think they'll be better at it. But it's interesting to me that now athletes are doing this during the season, like Angel Reese in her podcast, or Travis Kelce, Kelce and those guys. I'd never thought I'd see that, because we always used to try to do deals with athletes during the season, and you never really got their interest. This was years ago.
Because it's their podcast. I think
Yeah.
that's the differentiator.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's on their terms, and that's what's so great about it.
Yeah.
Does anyone else want to offer advice?
I think you said earlier, be yourself.
Yeah.
Your content is going to be terrible if you are trying to serve up what you think other people want. You've already dumbed down the whole thing. You've already taken yourself out of it. It's already like too algorithmic in a weird way. So I think just be authentic, be yourself, whatever that is. And you mess up and, figure that out. It takes a long time to figure that out. It's always kind of evolving, but I think that is like the most important thing more than anything else.
And it will live forever, so you might as well be yourself.
Yeah. You don't want to look back and be like, I spent 20 years doing something weird.
Yeah, and then real quickly, just would be curious to hear what you think the future looks like for athlete-driven content, something you're looking forward to, something you're anticipating happening in the athlete-driven content landscape. So just a real quick sort of look into the crystal ball as we conclude here.
I think what Megan and Sue are doing, I mean, honestly, like just how they have taken control of their narrative and what's important and putting it out there through the podcast, through the production company. Anytime I hear of like one of the great conferences that we know that's going on and these two are at it, it piques my interest. So I really respect what you guys have done and are doing.
Fantastic. Megan?
I think we're going to see more athlete content. What I hope is that it sort of adds to the media landscape. I think sometimes there's this narrative of like the old media, it just needs to go away and like we'll just do everything, which I don't think is good either. Like we're not journalists, and I think that there really needs to be a place for that. So my hope is that it's just additive to the already existing landscape of media and narrative and storytelling around sports. I think there's space for that, and we're seeing that. So hopefully it's just additive. And yeah, I don't like the narrative that like the media is the enemy. I always had a great relationship with the media and felt like I leveraged the media for what I wanted, but they also helped our sport grow a lot as well in terms of, just getting the truth out, frankly.
I'm really excited. I think it will be jet fuel for women's sports in particular, because I think women's sports has never had an engagement issue. It's more the distribution and the platform and the scale of that. And so I just think and we've seen this with everything. We used to do all or nothings on Premier League teams because we had Premier League rights. And the more you watch behind the scenes and learn more about the athletes, the more you cared, the more respectful fans you were. And I just think I already have always been a huge believer in women's sports, and I just think this will be jet fuel. And it's no coincidence to me that female college athletes are more engaging, and all the data shows, nothing against the men, but just they drive disproportionate social media interaction and things like that. I believe wholeheartedly that this content revolution has helped women's sports and will continue to do that.
I think that's a great note to end on, with athlete-driven content being jet fuel for women's sports. I want to thank Constance, Megan, and Marie, and thank you all. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.